All right. Matt, the mortgage guy here. I'm talking about Joe Biden's $25,000 down payment assistance grant. Right now, it's just a draft. I want to get into what it is, who's eligible, who's not eligible, whether I think it's a good idea, whether I think it's a bad idea, some good parts about it, some bad parts about it. And then towards the end of the video, I'm going to talk about some ideas I have. I've got smarter friends than myself that I talk to. And through some of these conversations, I thought to myself, wow, that's a really good idea. Maybe if enough of us talk about it, the right people will hear it. And this will help what inevitably is, the government trying to decrease this gap of home ownership disparity between races, because that's what this is. I'm not going to mince words. And before I get into it, this is a really, really hot topic, and it's something that I know can get people a little bit upset, and I don't want arguing in the comments. More than anything, I just want to have an open and honest discussion about it, because I really believe in what their mission is, and we'll get this out of the way. I'm a white guy, right? And so coming from a white guy who's going to talk about racial disparity in home ownership, some people don't want to hear it. A little bit about my background. I grew up poor. I went to public school. I went to some of the most diverse public schools in California, where I was the minority as a white guy. So I like to think that I'm just not some silver spoon who's been handed everything in my life that doesn't have a little bit of empathy and realize that this stuff is real. I've seen it. I felt it. I know, income inequality, housing inequality, all this stuff exists. And so that's the perspective I'm coming from, like it or not. Please be kind to each other in the comments. That's all I ask. So without further ado, we'll get into it. And first, I'll talk about what it is. And everyone should know before we even get into it, this is just a draft. This hasn't even turned into a bill that's been proposed. It's merely a draft. But something like this is coming. I know that this administration has said that it's a priority for this stuff to pass and for them to do something with home ownership, income inequality, wealth inequality, and whatnot. So no doubt something like this is coming. This is just the first draft. So we can talk about what's good and what's bad. First and foremost, who qualifies? This is the interesting part that most of the people that I've spoke to and that read it said, wow, that's interesting. It's going to be used for down payment assistance for first generation home buyers. That's not first time home buyers. That's first generation home buyers. You can be a first time buyer, never owned a house. But if your parents owned a house or currently own a house, they're not considering you a first generation home buyer. So some weird verbiage, some rules that you think to yourself, how are they going to really monitor that or know that? And how much is that going to, squeeze this, who qualifies for it? So far, they don't have a specific amount on how much funding they're going to give this program, but they're looking at like the next decade, 21 through 2030, how much they're going to need before they set that funding criteria. So that'll be interesting to see. And they're talking about it being administered under HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, which makes sense. And they can't use more than 5% of the funding they get for administrative stuff. The money's got to go where it's intended to go, right? And the administration of the program, meaning who's going to actually implement these programs and be involved in getting the money from government to people, is going to be the state agencies. For me in California, it's Cal HFA is the state agency for California. They already do down payment assistance programs. They already deal with other programs, so they know how to do this stuff, and they're going to be the ones administering this program. They're going to get that grant money, see who qualifies, set the parameters, and let lenders like myself know, here's what you have to do to qualify somebody. If they do qualify, here's where you apply. Here's how you do the application. Here's what's going to happen next. And so that is how it's going to get administered. Okay. Funds will be allocated by HUD based on a formula. This is just more of how it's going to get administered and use of funds and stuff, something that's not necessarily that important to the end user. But I'll just tell you what I know without even kind of just reading through all this mumbo jumbo stuff, right? Is if you're eligible for this down payment assistance program, you've got to be under 120% of the area median income, AMI. And they've used this for other programs. So this area median income thing is relatively common. You can Google that and find, okay, the area median income is $64,000 and I can't be more than 120% of that. So 1.2 times that 64 grand, I'm throwing out a random number. It's different everywhere. You'd have to make less than that to qualify. And besides those income qualifications, you're also going to have to be a first generation home buyer. And here's how they define it. And one thing is to define it. Another thing is how do you enforce it or look at that? Some things with mortgage, you just have to attest, right? And you sign, penalty of perjury, and, you can be law, you can have the money ripped back from you or whatever, that you'd have to sign for that. But I don't know, maybe they'll look into their systems and figure out if your parents owned a house. But either your parents never owned a home during your lifetime, or they owned a home and they lost it to foreclosure, short sale, or deed in lieu, and don't currently own a home. So a lot of folks who got devastated during this 2008, market crash, or they got into bad term, loans that were liar loans, they called them, adjustable rate loans, and those types of things. If they lost their home and don't own now, you'd be eligible. So I want to save some time. I don't want this video to get too long-winded. So read this. I'll attach this down below on like what type of mortgages they are. I really wanted to get into a little bit of why I think it's important and other things that I think that they can do besides this to do what inevitably they're trying to do. So check this graph out. For anybody who would want to argue the fact that there's wealth inequality and big portion of that is home ownership. Those two things are separate, right? Home ownership and wealth. But anybody who's read any stats on home ownership and wealth and generational wealth knows that home ownership is a huge vessel that helps people build wealth, especially generational wealth. You own a home, it goes up in value, it gets paid off, you pass it on to your kids. They own that home, they buy a rental property, they pass both of those on to their kids. Generational wealth gets created in real estate. You cannot dispute that. I'm sorry. They'll undoubtedly dispute me in the comments, right? But here's what the stats look like. And this is 2019, but they're very similar in 2021 and continue to be so. Between Black Americans, 42%, and white Americans, it's like a 31% difference. And when you get into the language of this bill, $20,000 for down payment assistance, then you get an extra $5,000 if you can show, God, I don't know what the verbiage they used was. If you can show some sort of racial inequality or something, right? It specifically names these four groups: Asians, American Indians, Hispanics, and Blacks. And this is the reason, because statistically, stats don't lie. If the home ownership rate is this much lower between white folks and Black, Latino, American Indian, and Asian, then to decrease that gap, you give incentives down here and you help these people buy. Now, here's something that I want to talk about that is very, very important. You can propose this bill. You can help by giving down payment assistance. But more importantly than any of that, you've got to increase financial education. And I know I've read and heard all kinds of different stuff, all kinds of different initiatives where you can imagine kids that are living on the streets in Baltimore, they don't know how to use credit cards. They don't know how to manage their credit wisely. And so you take somebody like that and they're 18, 19, 20 years old with zero financial education or very little, and you give them an incentive to help them buy a house. If they can't keep the house, if they can't continue to make the mortgage payments, they're not financially responsible, then this does not look like we want it to look in 2030 with more equality, right? And so the financial education piece is huge. And that's something that I won't get too deep into, but I'll just say that there's got to be initiatives that deal with that deal with some of the underlying issues and financial education, which is at the root of a lot of issues with wealth and jobs and whatnot. Lastly, I think I want to talk about what can be done and some neat ideas. I've My buddy Mike Zuber brought something up that I thought was genius, and I wanted to speak on that and maybe elaborate a little bit. If we're trying to maybe not just with wealth equality with races, but just in general, people who haven't had access to home ownership due to demographics, due to family history and whatnot. If we're trying to shorten that, on top of that in 2021, if we're trying to help people get into homes that are first-time home buyers that want to own or occupy the home, and we're saying root for them, investors that already own 10 homes, they've got enough. Let's make it harder for them. I'm okay with that. As an investor myself, it would be detrimental to me. But I'm okay with that if you tell me, let's put stuff in place that makes it easier for somebody to buy a home of their own who doesn't own a home, first-time home buyer and whatnot. You can incentivize through the tax code ways for people to, one, put more inventory into this market, put more house on the market, which we all know is needed, and two, do it in a way where it's much more likely to go to owner occupant than an investor. Let me give you an example. If you told somebody who owned rental properties that might sell, might not sell, hey, listen, if you sell to somebody who's going to own or occupy this house, someone who's a buyer, who's going to move their family in, you pay less capital gains. You pay, instead of 25% capital gains tax, you pay 10%. And you give them that 15% reduction. That's, kind of manipulating your agenda through the tax code. I'm much more likely to say, hey, listen, I've got a cash buyer that's willing to pay $500, even though the owner occupant is only willing to pay me $480. By saving 15% in tax on the $250,000 that I'm going to pay tax on, I'm getting an extra, what's $250,000 times 15%? Like $37,500. That makes that offer better, right? And then you say, if you sell it to somebody who's an owner occupant and they're in one of these affected classes, in these demographics of people that we really want to get in homes, then it goes down to 0%. Well, then I'm able to look at offers as a seller and say, oh, I'm going to sell to them. They're not even the highest offer, but I get a huge tax incentive if I sell to somebody who's a first-time buyer, or they're going to own or occupy with their family, or they're Black or Hispanic or something like that. And this is the way, in my opinion, that you can kill two birds with one stone. You help the home ownership inequality. You help the humongous supply issue where it's like, we need more houses on the market. I'm sorry. Yeah, supply. And so I don't know. I just thought that was genius. I know Zuber brought it up with that. And I'm sure there's more things that can be done as far as, tax benefits for getting homes to the right people. And I think most people would agree, and I'm sorry to investor friends of mine, but if rates on investment properties went up, if there was certain advantages for someone who's buying a home to live in versus an investor who's just buying it to rent out and make more cash flow and build more wealth, that would help this immensely. And it would affect not only how many houses got brought to market, but when they did get brought to market, who they would sell to. So just an idea. I don't know, just a random dude on YouTube with random thoughts. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions at all, please feel free to reach out. If you're looking for an out-of-state broker, or any broker, by that means, link in the comments, link in the description for how to get in touch with them. Thanks for watching.